Many thanks to you for coming. I'm David Scobie, the Executive Dean of the New School for General Studies, and Milano, the New School for Management and Urban Policy. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's panel to discuss Roberta Brandeis-Gratz's book, The Battle for Gotham, The Competing Legacies of Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses. It's co-sponsored by the New School, by the Nation Institute, as well as Haymarket Books, City Limits, and Democrats.com, and I want to thank all of them for helping to make this happen. I especially want to thank Andy Breslow and Taya Kittman of the Nation Institute, our primary partners, for working to make this program a reality, and to send a special shout out to my colleague Pamela Tillis, the Director of Programs for the New School for General Studies, who does extraordinary work making our forums, panels, and readings one of the richest public spheres in New York City. Tonight's event is one of a long series of partnerships between the New School and the Nation Institute, and I'm delighted that Andy and Pam have made this collaboration such a rich one. Tonight's discussion brings together three themes that are near and dear to the New School: urban politics, the New York City landscape, and intellectual battle. Our university has been a site for battles for Gotham, a place where planners and urbanists like me have studied and analyzed and taught about those battles, and like tonight, a public forum for citizens to gather, to revisit, and reflect on those battles. We could not have a better group of guests to unpack and perhaps contest the legacies of Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses. To introduce our guests, I'm going to turn the podium over to David Broncaccio, who will serve as moderator for tonight's panel. Many of you will know David from his work as special correspondent for the Economy 4.0 project on public radio's Marketplace. He has hosted Now on PBS and contributed to BBC World News America, to CNN and NBC, and he's the author of the book Squandering Aimlessly, about money and values. Please join me in welcoming David, Roberta Brandeis-Gratz, and Richard Sennett.
Hi, how are you? Wow, the Nation put something on the list and look what happens. They're a machine, but it really took you to make the effort on a chilly night, so thank you. Just a quick paragraph here before we really get going in earnest. I have been on a voyage of discovery to learn about ways to make our shattered economy better serve more people. It's not a controversial or partisan pursuit. Make the economy better serve more people. And forgive me, New Yorkers, out of the box, we opted to look for solutions not on Wall Street, but on Main Street. So at every compass point, I turned myself. Everywhere I looked, every community we pursued, we found examples of people working to create jobs, spawn livelihoods, and increase well-being by keeping the thinking grassroots, local, to nurture community and social capital over mega approaches. One smart person we spoke with in Washington State calls the conventional financial system the one-night stand economy. And what they're trying to move toward is the relationship economy. Some people call them local living economies, and they're more like ecosystems than the way we normally think about economics, always with dollar signs attached and never honoring the relationships that can go into a more nurturing type of economy. I will never get the chance, of course, to meet Jane Jacobs or Robert Moses, but I can guess which one would be most interested in these Main Street projects that we've identified. And you can see it on TV next week. It's not this Friday, but the Friday after, the 19th, 9:30 on PBS, called Fixing the Future. And that's the end of my plug. I'm going to introduce our two panelists, and then Roberta's going to speak for a bit to frame her thesis, and then we're going to talk to Richard for a bit, let him speak for a bit. We will then get a rollicking discussion going up here at the table, and then we'll turn it over to you, and I guess there'll be cards that'll be sent around. You can write some questions down, and hopefully we'll emerge with a deeper understanding of these issues. So first of all, Roberta Brandeis Gratz, kick-ass journalist and urban critic, lecturer, New Yorker. This is not her first book. There's also The Living City, Thinking Small in a Big Way, and Cities Back from the Edge, New Life for Downtown. Mayor Bloomberg appointed Roberta to the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission in 2003. Her pieces have appeared all over the place. A short list would be, of course, the Daily News, New York Times Magazine, The Nation, Wall Street Journal, Tikkun, a long list. So let's welcome Roberta Brandeis Gratz. Sure.
I'm thrilled looking at this audience. I feel like I'm home. I am a villager by birth and mindset. I want to give you some random thoughts that obviously come from the book and that I think will help us have a kind of lively conversation tonight and perhaps inspire some questions from all of you. Essentially, I begin by saying we have lost our recent memory. We don't remember how bad things were if some people didn't even know from the 1970s, and bad enough so that at the time, the one prediction I'll share with you is that the population of New York was going to fall to 5 million. It was pretty bad. And we don't really understand, at least in my estimation, of how we got to where we are today. I find looking at that history through the lens of Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses is a very useful way to understand where we've been and where we've come from. My general thesis is that we were at our worst in the 70s because of Moses, and we emerged from the 70s to today when he left the scene and the organic city was able to regenerate. That's the larger argument. The best neighborhoods in the city today are the ones he never touched, and the ones in the most trouble are the ones he did. There is no proper accounting for the rebirth through the immigrants that have come, particularly emerging in big way starting in the 80s. The fact that the regeneration energy started all at the bottom in our neighborhoods and literally gurgled up, starting in the 70s when nobody cared. Some of the most creative things were happening. I wrote about these things in my first book, The Living City, and I showed how the whole rebirth of the South Bronx literally started block by block, building by building. Eventually, as the momentum picked up, developers came in, did some of the really grotesque things like building ranch houses in the South Bronx, and then taking credit for the turnaround that had already started, or else they wouldn't have even been there. They're never the first ones into a down-and-out neighborhood. Now, as good as it looks, we're too much about Wall Street and too much about tourism, and we've lost what we really were about, what made us so strong. During the war, World War II, you have to define which wars these days, New York did better than most cities economically because we were the most diverse industrial-based city in the country. We were never a single smokestack town. We were lots of small and modest things, and that was our strength. And we have been losing that not naturally. There are experts and there are planners who will tell you manufacturing is dying. They've been saying that for 40 years and making it a self-fulfilling prophecy. I argue and I show in the book that this is not the case, and for all of you who read the daily newspaper periodically, there are wonderful stories about buildings in Brooklyn or Queens or at Long Island City and the Bronx in which there are lots of creative people doing small, new, artisanal-based things that will eventually become and can become the new production-based economy. It will never have the old, large, assembly line type of economy, but that's not where we should be looking. And if we look at the history of all of our big corporations today, every one of them, from Ford to Nike to Starbucks, across the board, they all started either in a garage or in a dorm room at Harvard or some other college, or in a hole in the wall in Seattle's Pike Place Market. So just a few other thoughts. Moses was all about top-down, total control, clean slate. He had total disdain for any civic voice. He was a czar of the highest order. He was a racist, and he had a vision that he was imposing on the city. He didn't understand what a city is about and how it functions, and he plowed through the city in a way that we have not understood the full extent of the coverage. No one has ever measured, and somehow I am going to try to get something together that does this. No one has ever really measured how much we lost under Moses. By my calculation, and that's just randomly adding up the projects that I have found where there are statistics about how many people and businesses were lost and demolished, I say close to 1 million people out of a city at the time of 8 million. That's a high number, and that doesn't even count the number of businesses that were put out of business, not closed, put out of business for whether it was highways, high tower developments, whether they were public housing or middle-class housing, or whether they were Lincoln Center or the United Nations or any of or NYU, any of those things. So it's just never been calculated, and I think it's much bigger than we have come to understand. Jane, on the other hand, was a process person. She understood the city as an organic process, not about projects, about how the city works and how you have to let it work and let the layers of time work their way through some losses, some gains, but never cataclysmically. She spoke of cataclysmic money, and that's what the Moses projects are all about, and we have some of those today. So that takes me to, and by way of a little background, I had a very long and wonderful relationship with Jane Jacobs. I was introduced to her by my first editor in 1978 when I was starting to write my first book, and we had very lively conversations, many of which I taped and many of which I draw on in this book. And one of the chapters is based on interviews with her over the demise of Westway, for those of you who remember the highway that was supposed to go along the Hudson River west side. A very pivotal event in the framing of the cities, what the values of the city were all about. Highway versus public transit, local versus, big. So it's a very important chapter to me in the book because of her voice. It's very important to understand the precursors of regeneration, then, now, and today. And we're going to talk about the future, and in my mind, what we are not good at doing is recognizing the precursors for regeneration, nurturing them, letting them survive, versus wiping them out and not giving the opportunity for new things and for neighborhoods to organically regenerate. So in the end, my point is that we have both Moses and Jacobs today. There's a myth out there that Jane Jacobs prevails. Well, she doesn't prevail in Atlantic Yards, and she doesn't prevail in Columbia. She doesn't prevail on Willets Point. That's where Moses prevails. But she does prevail in thinking where you see the changes in public transportation and pedestrian amenities. Jeanette Sada Khan, a friend and hero of mine, is strip by strip whittling away at the Moses legacy and returning a city to pedestrians and local, and giving us back the street that was given over too much to the car. So I juxtapose the Moses and the Jacobs today. We have transportation, we have historic preservation, and we have urban agriculture, are the three areas that I use in the book to show where the Jacobs influence is definitely there. And the three that I mentioned are where Moses is with us today. I think the future, we must return to the diversity of our economy. A lot of what David just talked about is what I'm looking for and finding all over this country. I believe we are braced to see that new economy if we can recognize it, between the weak dollar and the high transportation costs, and if what I heard once mentioned, and I haven't heard it since, but hopefully might, instead of giving tax incentives to businesses taking jobs overseas, if we just leveled the playing field, we could regenerate a diverse economy. And we must remember that 85% of the new jobs in the economy come from businesses of 100 or smaller, 100 employees or less. We cannot become more of a bedroom community for Wall Street or a playground for tourists. We're overrun with both. We need to diversify, and the only way we will is if we diversify that economy. And lastly, I often like to say when I speak at various places around the country, there are really three things we need to think about in any city in terms of returning the cities not to exactly what they were, but to what cities are about before I mean, there's not a city in the country that didn't go the way of clearance, Moses style, either with his help or without it. And the three things are bringing back density, returning public transit, and improving public education. Those three things, everything else will take care of itself. One image I will leave you with, I do get around to a lot of cities, and there are statistically 60% of most downtowns in America are devoted to parking. You can't have a city when 60% is just devoted to parking. We don't need to tear down one more building in any city in America in order to regenerate a city. All we need to do is start filling in some of the blank spaces, not just with residential, but with the opportunity to start new economic activity and let the rest organically take its shape. And from there, go to Richard.
Yeah, Roberta, I was in Youngstown, Ohio this summer doing some reporting for the BBC. It's all parking lot. That's all that's in there. It was shocking. Richard Sennett, professor of sociology at NYU, has thought deeply and written about urban sociology. Teaches at the London School of Economics. Do you still go over to LSE? He's author of very long list. Respect in an Age of Inequality, a book called The Craftsman, The Uses of Disorder from many years ago, but quite relevant to our discussion tonight. Practicing Culture, many, many more. In the 1970s, Richard founded with Susan Sontag and Joseph Brodsky the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU. Chicago man, right? Yeah, not a New Yorker. Cabrini Green Housing Project, I guess, was your first dwelling as an infant. And many people may know this about you, but in case you don't, Richard entered adulthood with great promise as a cellist and a pianist. Richard Sennett.
I'm really glad to be here tonight to celebrate Roberta's book, which is a wonderful book. It is both a story of a past battle, but it's also really opens perspectives on future battles that we're going to have to fight in New York, and I think in all American cities as well. And I see it's on sale over there, and I'm just going to mention that to you. Like Roberta, I knew Jane Jacobs very well, and I certainly think she won the battle of hearts and minds with Moses. But I also felt that there were questions about the way Jane saw cities that made me slightly uneasy. And argued with her. She was somebody who liked to argue, Jane Jacobs. If you agreed with her, she was slightly disappointed. And I'm still sort of, in a way, arguing with her, and I'll share you a little of why I'm arguing with her still in my head tonight. The issue to me was, in her work, was always what knits a city together. She had an incredible sense of the local in particular and the diverse. But the question in my mind was, how does this come together? And because I think of her battles with Moses, who had this, I would say, almost fascist notion of wholeness, that the alternative of how a city knits together, particularly economically, was something that went to the back of her mind. The question came home to me several years ago when New York City applied to the Olympics, to build the Olympics here in 2012. And the plan it submitted, which was terrible in many ways, had one very striking aspect to it, which the Olympic Committee pushed the then Deputy Mayor for Economic Development on over and over again. What will bringing the Olympics do for New York City? And his answer was, well, it'll bring in a lot of tourist money, and we'll have these great sports facilities. And people in the Olympics said to him, no, we mean, how will it knit the city together? How will spending $15, $20 million do something for the economy of New York that's sustained? To which he had no answer. He could only imagine creating a kind of, doing something for the city, this is Dan Doctorow, in terms of just pouring cash into it, which was the old Moses answer as well. He had no idea of what it would mean to generate an economy in New York. And I think we still suffer from that problem. How do we invest in local communities in a way that makes them help one another? In part, if you were an academic urbanist, and I don't recommend that to any of you, it says it's a problem about edge conditions. That is, how at the edges between communities do you get more interaction? It's a problem we see in natural ecology, that some kinds of natural ecologies, when two communities meet, they have very intense interaction between the two. And that's, properly speaking, a border. A boundary is when you get two communities that meet up, like where different primates or lions meet, and the edge is dead. And that's a boundary proper. And this distinction between boundaries and borders is a very important one in thinking about urban economy. We want more borders, that is where communities intersect, and fewer boundaries, where these edges between communities are dead spaces. And for me, that's been kind of the way of thinking about, about the problem I don't think Jane addressed. Now, those edges, those living edges in a city, come in many different fashions. If you walk across 14th Street still, after all the gentrification that's occurred, if you walk, as I do with my students every year, from the Hudson all the way over to the East River. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I mean, these living edges come in all forms. If you walk across 14th Street, as I do with my students every year, from the Hudson to the East River, you pass through an incredible zones of transition, almost block by block. And we've been interviewing, for many years, we've been interviewing small shopkeepers on, as you walk across this, the ones who have survived gentrification. And there's a lot of mutual support that goes on. Everything from policing shoplifters to occasionally making each other loans to dealing with landlords and so on. That's rare in New York, and we have no mechanisms for really encouraging more of that kind of interaction. We have lots of mechanisms for helping local communities defined by identity to support themselves as distinct. For instance, we have ways of supporting in New York Korean grocers, which is an important part of our local economy. But how a Korean grocers, there is a Korean grocers retail association in New York, how they would interact with, say, retailers in Brighton Beach who are servicing the Russian community is a kind of tissue that we haven't made. They are separated in kind of boundary condition from each other. And so that's kind of the problem that worried me about Jane's work, which is how to have more of 14th Street and less local in the sense of something that's really defined as identifiable as just one community. Of course, it's worried me in racial terms as well as ethnic terms. I think there's a social implication from that, and that's the last thing I want to talk about. I think the people who were Jane Jacobs' heirs had a very strong sense of the importance of local communities having distinct identities. You know, that when you were in a place, you knew what kind of place it was like. But those edges, those places where the city knits together, are places that have a weaker kind of identity. If you look at the borders between Spanish Harlem and Black Harlem, for instance, the zones of transition are not places where people would say, that's really the center of my community. And yet those are very important edges. And I think one of the reflections that I've had on Jane Jacobs' writing, wonderful it is, important as it's been, is that perhaps it overemphasized the relation between the local and something that we could call local identity. To have a city that knits together, perhaps the identity of communities is going to weaken. That we can less identify who's where in the city at those places that knit the city together. So these are thoughts I've had about Jane. I think they're also thoughts you've had about her in a way as well. But I think tonight what we really want to talk about is the economic side of this. That is, how we rebuild cities in a way that allows them both to be dynamic at a local level and also to add up to something more than just being the sum of their parts. Thank you very much.
Roberta, give me a better sense of how you think, because we're going to talk about the future here. Just give us a sense of how the ghost of Robert Moses, you believe, still haunts the system. And you pointed to the big projects, but just the philosophy is still there in some ways.
The philosophy is still there. It's more subtle when, in terms of what we think of, in terms of our a certain perspective. For example, we don't necessarily have it all in big projects, but we do have it in zoning. And this is where we're shaping the city in big ways, in reshaping the city in big ways, where projects don't even exist. We're also, I think, we're still locked into an erroneous thinking, because whenever there's redevelopment in any of the old urban renewal neighborhoods, it's all on a suburban scale. I mean, we have built in the last 30 years more suburbanized single-family attached homes in neighborhoods that used to have, 4 or 6-story, modest-sized dwellings mixed with small apartment houses, some single dwellings. The diversity of the city, which is very dense when it's allowed to be, we've not only lost, but there is this myth that still exists that de-densification is a way to deal with crime and poverty. Just the reverse is true. And what we don't realize, for example, is that a lot of our public housing projects, because they're tall, people think they're very dense. They, in fact, replaced streets of mixed tenements and apartment house stuff that was much more dense and much more fluid in its urban qualities in terms of mixing people. What we've done, and we still do, is we think in terms of groups of people. We've lost confidence in an old urban process that really naturally finds different kinds of people and different economic circumstances and backgrounds living together. And we do have some of those neighbors. This is one of the things, believe it or not, that fascinates me today in New Orleans, where you still have this traditional urban blend, neighborhood by neighborhood, in a lot of places where people are living next door to people. They don't necessarily socialize, but they are totally different, either economically, racially, ethnically, whatever it is. So the mindset is still more boundary driven. I love this, Richard. You've given me a whole new edges versus boundary. It's not edge driven, and that is a mindset that doesn't necessarily have to be in big projects. Also, we're not. We were, and as I record in the book, we were certainly well on our way to restoring the centrality of public transit over the dominance of the car. I mean, the battle over congestion pricing was very revealing in terms of people's feeling of entitlement to drive around the city. Jane used to say, it was very funny, she says, "Oh, I have no objection to the car. It's infinitely better than the horse and cart. But if you choose to live in a 20-ton metal cocoon," which she quoted, what's his name? I forget. At any rate, then that's fine. But you live with the consequences. Don't try to remake the city to accommodate that. The city is people-based, not car-based. We haven't erased that entirely. We're getting there. So it's a way of thinking, and it's still very much new is progress, old is sentimental. And 8 years on the Landmarks Commission, I can tell you, I saw this so many times. If one more person came to testify for some new mega project in a historic district and say, we can't always freeze the city, I wanted to scream out, what city are you talking about? This city has been transformed in the last 10 years with new construction in every corner, and some of the most dramatic new buildings are in historic districts. We are stuck in thinking of some of these things and not understanding the creativity and the reuse and the adding modestly and in small ways and some big ways to an existing fabric. So that one of my favorite quotes from Mumford, who I didn't agree with on a lot of things, but he always said, time has to be visible. And it's not visible when it's all done in one fell swoop.
By the way, Roberta, I was reading the book that Moses himself didn't drive.
No, but he was driven.
He was driven.
He was chauffeured.
Oh, I see, one of those guys.
One of those guys, right.
One of those.
Richard, big capital likes big projects. Politicians like to point to something that maybe has their authorship. But even urban planners like to, what they call, I guess, rationalize the stuff they work on. And Roberta talks about Jane Jacobs liking projects that bubble up from the grassroots, that are organic. That's sort of the opposite of planning, isn't it?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it depends what kind of planning you do. I give you the example of in planning for Olympics, where you can do something big which also makes time visible. That's the way people in Barcelona design their Olympic project, and what we're trying to do in London now. But I'll tell you about the Barcelona example, because it's there. It was designed to be something that added something that really didn't exist in Barcelona, which is huge, you know, an auditorium, stadium, and so on. But what the planners did was they made sure that there were transport links out to these big space-using things, and that everything that could be included in the fabric of the city by renovation was done in that way. So half of the housing for the Olympic athletes and the television, communications, all of that stuff was reuse. Now, there's a lot of money that went into that. But the idea, and there was a lot of renovation in the sense that buildings were cleaned, you could tell that somebody had intervened. But the notion was that by inserting the new into the old, that you could create a huge renovation project which looked like it was logical progression from what had been there before. When you look at something like what the Greeks did for their Olympics, there's the historic city of Athens, and then there's this Olympic garbage, which is outside of it, which the Greeks all say, well, that's not really Athens. But it was one of the things that helped bankrupt Greece. So there's no sustained value in that. And I think the trick in large-scale planning is to think like a catalog, to think the way the Barcelonans did. That is, how can you get scale, which, I love this phrase, which makes, I don't like Mumford either. I have a lot of problems with him.
He was
But
occasionally quotable.
he was horrible. But anyhow, we won't get into that. This is all past history. He hated Jane Jacobs, by the way. He felt the hot breath of someone else on his. Anyhow, we won't go into that.
But you like the quote.
I love the quote. But do you understand what I'm saying about it? It would have been, it's for us in New York the question of when we built Roosevelt Island, for instance, which is a big project that's built from scratch. Why did we build something that looks like it doesn't have any kind of natural place in New York? Why doesn't it deal with the fact that it's an island? You know what I mean? That's when it's not what I'm trying. I guess my answer to you is it's not a question of scale. It's a question of, I would say, of environmental awareness in a really deep sense, and that I think has failed in New York. That
That's a
sense of the way things relate to one another. And I must say, as a planner, I'm afraid that what we're going to get downtown in the 9/11 reconstruction is more of the same. That is something that doesn't make time visible. We get lots of monuments. We're going to get buildings that make time visible only in the sense that the first 8 stories of them have to withstand something like an atomic bomb, so that they look, you know, they completely shut off from the rest of the city. But we haven't mastered the art of making scale work in New York. That's how I'd answer your question.
I think Roosevelt Island is a very interesting example because, and in fact, I wrote about Roosevelt Island in my first book,
Yeah,
because the
you
real
did.
issue with Roosevelt Island was what we invested in a totally new community, while a once thriving, redeemable, recoverable city was being left to rot. This is when the Bronx was purposefully being left to burn and building new, and the amount of public investment that went into Roosevelt Island, I think it finally stopped. But this was in the 70s when I was looking at it. It was upwards of 300+ million a year. That was real money in the 70s. And the question is, where do you put your resources? And that's the scale issue, because it's about a level playing field. If you see, the problem is that if you were to invest in modest ways where it really counts, they're not good photo ops. And they're not good they don't make good boasting material. So it's really a challenge. And I have to say, for public officials who understand these things, which it's rare, not always before they become those officials, but then when they get into the policy-making position, because they need those, what do you call it? They need to be able to demonstrate something big. And that's a problem. And Jane, one of the erroneous things today is Jane's accused, I have to get this off my chest. Jane is accused of wanting to replicate the village everywhere. You can't find this anywhere in her writing, but she used the village as a laboratory of how to study how things work in a city, on a street, in a neighborhood, or whatever. But I've heard people say, well, she wants to replicate everything, the 6-story standard, which is so absurd. I live in a neighborhood on the Upper West Side of 30, 40-story buildings. She would never dream of expecting anything but within that context of being. So that's number one. But also, the idea that she was only for old buildings and only for small. Well, Jane was a big advocate of big, but not necessarily big developer-inspired projects. Big public transit, big health and hospital systems, big library systems, school systems, and infrastructure. And with this comes the notion we need a little bit of Jacobs and a little bit of Moses, and I have to say this is an oxymoron. You can't have both. You got to pick and choose. Pick one or the other, because the idea that nothing big can happen without a Robert Moses, excuse me, we have a train to the plane, we have a rebuilt West Side Highway, we have a third water tunnel, the biggest public project in the entire country, somehow chugging along without a Moses. We have a new water infiltration plant up in the park in Upper Manhattan. We have we have 2 new stadiums built. That maybe one might debate the value of that, but we had a big transformation of Grand Central Station, of Central Park, of all sorts of big things. But the notion is promoted that we can't get anything big done because they are Moses kind of bigs. They are the Atlantic Yards or the big clearance project. I know some people would like to say, well, we're past the Moses era. We've learned how to advance without displacing as much, in small ways, Moses. But it's not a matter of whether you displace 100 people or 1,000 people. It's the way you approach these things. And big scale, it's big as possible, but not necessarily all in one place.
I want to pick up on a phrase you used and get you to amplify it, but also get Richard's reaction. You talked about identifying the precursors of regeneration. How do we spot those? Who are they? And how do we get government to invest in those precursors?
Well, the first thing we have to do is to get government to recognize them and not wipe them out. Over decades, and I have a few examples in the book, there were young, very earnest young planners who would be out looking at neighborhoods and come back and report, there really are things happening in those old buildings. There are small factories and different companies operating. And there were people in the planning department who were saying, I don't want to hear that. Just write the report, as I told you, and so that we can upzone with the idea that there's not that it needs to be put to a better use. It is very hard for conventional planners to recognize that small businesses have the potential to grow and employ people in places where it's very messy, graffiti, brick, nothing historically, aesthetically pleasing, but functional. So the precursors are often in those neighborhoods. And what happens is you get what I could only call as propaganda, that these neighborhoods are blighted and need to be replaced, and you get all these statistics of investment and jobs and new people. But just for example, at Atlantic Yards, before it was cleared, and some very serviceable buildings, a couple of which had $1 million condos in them, so the definition of blight is turned on its head. Atlantic Yards had 33 businesses, 235 jobs, 169 homes, 334 residents. The Columbia site had 400 residents in affordable housing, including 160 low-income, 70 businesses, 1,200 jobs, including 150 artists. Those neighborhoods were designated legally and being held up in the courts as blighted. The term blight in this country is an excuse for Moses-style clearance, pure and simple.
Richard, the government, whoever's in power in Washington, loves saying that small businesses are the engine of the future. They don't often follow through in helping small businesses and medium-sized businesses. But actually, you'd agree with them if a George W. Bush or Barack Obama said that we have to focus on these smaller-sized enterprises in trying to fix a city.
If only I could believe them.
That's the thing.
Yeah, that's the problem. This is a hobby horse for both Roberta and for me. And I just want to say something about it economically, that small urban manufacturing is the greatest generator for dollar invested of jobs. that it's the greatest investment we can make in jobs. And much more important than bringing Deutsche Bank to New York is, or giving the New York Stock Exchange tax breaks so that it doesn't leave. Whenever they threaten to leave, I think, isn't that great to go? But much more important is to stimulate craft and economic, small, I would say small productive rather than small retail activities. The great sadness that I have is, and since you've asked me this, I'm going to answer fairly frankly about it, is that in the end, I don't think the present administration thinks that differently from the administration of George Bush. It was predictable that if you gave banks an enormous amount of money without taking political control of them, that they would clean their balance sheets, which is just what they've done. They don't lend to small businesses. This phrase, cleaning up the balance sheet, means holding on to money that you were given by the public. And there's a very specific way, there was a huge argument in the Obama administration about this, whether to take preferred or ordinary stock. And they chose to take preferred, that is non-voting stock, which is like making a gift to banks which have not turned around to do anything in this country. I hate to say it, but I think in a way we've had a great continuity from about 1995 to 2010 in the way in which we've looked at investment. Whether it's Democratic or Republican, Clinton wasn't that much better about it. In fact, this Rubinate are all Clinton's, you know, Geithner, et cetera. You've got me started on this. You have to take the consequences of it.
Rubinate, that's a cool term, pertaining to Robert Rubin.
Right. So I think that's a terrific problem, and we're paying for it in New York because the money is there but not given to us. And that's not a problem the city can fix. We'd have to have a real change in how we think about capitalism. And we don't have a mayor, may I say, that I think is inclined. Maybe he could be brought around as a socialist, but I'm slightly dubious about it. But this is, I think, the great bind in this. I think Roberta and I know what to do to create those additive effects in cities, and that means investing in small, productive businesses. But it's not going to happen from the city. The city can't make that happen. It really requires a change in the way capitalism is structured. You know? It can't happen from below. And
What do you think, Roberta? No?
Well, I think I always talk about the level playing field. I think a lot of these things, in many ways, you know, I share a certain economic conservatism with Jane in the sense that it's almost better just to leave some of these areas and leave some of these businesses alone, but in effect, don't interfere with them in making way for, you know, the kind of development that's going to increase the real estate investment value in these neighborhoods. When we allow in industrial neighborhoods, we allow hotels, and I forget what some other, you know, uses. When you start raising the values in industrial neighborhoods, you price out the businesses that are just small and growing and don't have the opportunity. And so what happens is they grow to a certain point. They can't find another place in the city that's cost effective, so they leave. And this is where we're failing. I agree totally with, and I think I have to say that this administration did stop all the investment in big corporations that threaten to leave. But in the process, they also are resisting on some level. They're cautious about investing in, nurturing the small things, although there are some people in the administration who really believe in it. So I think it's a matter of avoiding doing some of the wrong things, and again, letting, as I keep talking about, letting the precursors develop, grow, and mature. What's his name has started, Nike, started selling athletic shoes out of the back of a station wagon imported from Japan. We know where Facebook started. We know where all these things started. We don't recognize that the economy is a process like the city's a process. And by the way, Jane's most important book, and the one that she considered her most important, was her second book, The Economy of Cities, which really goes into how economies work. If we understand how economies work, we will know how to let the precursors develop into full body companies.
We have some fabulous questions here. Well, is there an applause? I don't want to walk on that. These are fabulous questions. I'm going to go to it in just a sec. Just one last thing I had to ask you, Roberta.
Okay.
A book published by Nation Books that gets favorable treatment in the National Review. What accounts for that?
I
and
loved it.
What does it say about your analysis?
I loved it because I talk of myself as a social liberal and an economic conservative because I don't believe in big subsidies, government subsidies, because they all go to the wrong thing. So and this is. A wonderful parallel because it puts me in a little bit of a position. I don't by any means put myself on the same level as Jane Jacobs. Nobody was on her level. But she was loved by the libertarians and the left at the same time because it's not about red and blue, left and right, Democrat, Republican. These are non-political issues. This is understanding how things work. And there are Democrats and Republicans who get it as wrong or as right as the next person. It's not a party affiliation. So I loved the validation that I was getting understood on the right as well as on the left.
All right, now to your questions. The first one is sort of newsy here, so I thought I'd start with that. Regarding Atlantic Yards,
I knew this
what do you
was coming.
think of the Supreme Court ruling yesterday that Empire State Development Corporation needs to reopen the question of whether more environmental review is needed?
Well, given my feelings about Atlantic Yards, I think anything that exposes how that process was manipulated and wrong, even though these court decisions, there have been a few that have helped the process, open the process to show what has been so deceptive and manipulated in the process. Any decision like that that helps expose it is useful. Whether it lasts, holds up in higher court, I don't know. The tragedy is that the fabric that could have been a fabric that was filled with the precursors that could have kept growing is gone. So we have destroyed a neighborhood that was a tax-paying district, and all those taxes are gone. So all the promised jobs, promised housing, promised taxes will come I don't know that I'll live long enough to see it, but in the meantime, look at what was wiped out. So any court decision like that is just one more help in exposing it.
Richard, here's a question. How do you get people to think long-term? And this is contextualized in terms of stadiums and Atlantic Yards providing immediate jobs, but think longer than the immediate jobs.
That's a very good question. I don't know who asked this question, but when you think about long-term, did you mean long-term for the people who hold the jobs, or for the work they're going to do? The reason I do this is not just an academic kind of quibble. A lot of, in the creative industries in New York and in a lot of small-scale manufacturing, there's a lot of cycling in and out of those jobs. Businesses fail, people go out of them, they leave them, and so on. But what they leave behind, and the most durable thing they leave behind, are sort of networks of association. If you look at the way in which Silicon Alley works in New York City, for instance, a lot of those businesses are not viable businesses. But the contacts people make, the use they make of other services in the city, gradually opens up opportunities. And now I think Roberta and I are way on the opposite side of the fence economically, because I'm good socialist, Roberta, I'd never give it up.
Oh, I wouldn't. Well,
Yeah, well, anyhow. But I wouldn't say that investing in things that you think are going to succeed is a way of creating a viable economy. But investing in communities where there's lots of toing and froing, and if people fail at one thing, they can do something else, is viable. That's the story of Silicon Valley, which had businesses that most of which aren't viable and yet grew a community. And I think we need that same model in New York.
I would agree with that, Richard. What didn't happen in Silicon Valley was buckets of government money to create Silicon Valley.
True.
It emerged in its own and then became all those, and it's the whole cluster and things that grow on each other. And I think that's the natural economy that government fails to respect until it's of a scale like Silicon Valley, especially if it's technology. We worship technology today. But my point about opposing big government support is because it just goes into wiping these things out too many times, not
I
supporting
think that's true. But on the other hand, I'd much rather waste a lot of money on businesses that were going to go bust in New York that built up a kind of infrastructure of associations and networks than buy a submarine that costs 20 times more than it does. I don't think efficiency is really what cities are about.
No, absolutely not. Failure with value is what I used to call it.
Yes, absolutely. I knew you were on the right side.
Someone is concerned about the tourists concept from earlier. You seem to be concerned with the number of tourists visiting our city. Pourquoi? No, it says why. Other world-class cities like Paris seem to thrive, and their visitors, tourists, are a big part of the fabric. What's the problem with tourists?
It's not the problem with tourists. It's the problem with where public investment goes. In other words, the tax breaks go to more hotels or more tourist-related businesses and creating jobs in the tourist industry. We know how to invest in that. We don't know how to invest in other things. The tourist industry is thriving and should be able to take care of itself. It's the things that aren't doing so well that need attention. So I love tourists up to a certain point. It's what's done for them that's not done for us. For example, I just, this pushes a button. I come out of the theater and I want to take the bus home, but there are 3 tourist buses parked in the bus stop to take people to, I don't know, Westchester, New Jersey or whatever, door-to-door service. I don't get that. I mean, if you're there, it's a little bit also, I feel this about bringing students to urban universities. Don't treat them like with the suburban style that they're used to living. Don't give them a little bus service that goes around the village to take them from one place to another. Let them walk, let them bike, let them get around like we all do, and like I did when I went to NYU decades ago. So it's that mentality that lets them come and bring a lifestyle with them that we don't have. So it's the urban lifestyle. You come here, we're a great city, that's why you're coming. So function the way we do. That's
Well, I mean, I think there's a real issue about this in New York because I'm a terrible snob. I don't like tourists. But putting my snobism aside about this, I think we've given over too much of Manhattan to servicing tourists. I regret the regeneration of Times Square, and I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. In between all those undoubted whorehouses and sleaze parlors and so on, if you go into many of those buildings, they were small, viable businesses that were thriving because they had cheap rents. I'm an amateur musician, and there were buildings throughout Times Square where you could get a bow. I played the cello. You could get a cello bow mended. You could buy strings. The whole sort of infrastructure of businesses above the ground floor. And those were all cleared out, as you say, because it was considered to be run down. And I think there's a big issue in New York. We're facing it now in the Village, which is the green market in Union Square really for people who are buying food? Or is it becoming another one of these kind of spectacular places for tourists? I think New York really did itself an injury by replanning so much of the city to make tourists feel comfortable. If they don't feel comfortable, but it works for us, don't let them come. Now, as I say, I'm a snob about this, but there has to be a limit. And there are cities that have put limits on it. Prague is a very impressive example of a city that has decided they have a charter of tourists' rights and unrights.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm. That is, places that cannot be touricized. Places where there are, and it has to do with where chains like McDonald's or Starbucks, there was a Starbucks in Prague, which thank God crashed. You know, it's a very good concept to have a notion of where there are tourist rights and unrights, and we don't have it in New York, and I'm horrified by it. I'm horrified by what happened to Times Square, and I think what is happening to Lincoln Center, you know? So that's a de-development, I would see, that's important, a restraint.
A lot of these questions are connected to something that the panel feels very strongly about, which is what is perceived as sort of an attack on small businesses, businesses with character. Here, I'll read two together. What do you think of the Coney Island rezoning and the resulting loss of small businesses there that have been displaced? Another one, how do we address the war being waged against local industry? For example, the evisceration of the floral district and the planned/forced destruction of the garment district. It says, forgive the hyperbole, but it might not be hyperbole.
It isn't.
It isn't hyperbole. It's what I was really trying to say. This is the antithesis of respecting the precursors. You know, the floral, I was a reporter, I like to say, it's all one word, old New York Post, pre-Murdoch New York Post. And I remember doing stories about the florist district and the flower district, and it has amazed me how long it has survived. So that I'm particularly troubled when I see this, because these are natural economic clusters. You know, we've given over some of the food distribution markets up in the Bronx to big retail. So some of those food vendors are now servicing us from New Jersey. For a mall, this is nuts. I have to say the intention, the designs on the Garment Center, this has been nibbled away for decades. There have been changes in the zoning in the garment district that has nibbled away, some of which has worked not as bad as some people feared. But there's been some real pushback today, and so far it's succeeding. The Garment Center is really, there are people there mobilizing in new ways. The idea of bringing them all, socially engineering, economically engineering it so that they all function in one building. That's not how the economy works. And unless we recognize how economies actually work, we're not going to understand how to respect them. And this is what was fundamental Jacobs. She was all about observation, observation, observation. Don't tell me what should happen. Don't tell me how it should happen. Tell me what happens. Go look, go walk, look, and see. And this is not the basis of how we plan too many places in this city and a lot of other cities. So these are legitimate questions. I don't know the Coney Island zoning package well. I haven't followed it, but I read what you all read in the paper, and it seems to me that some of the authentic fabric, the authentic businesses are being pushed out by the new developer, and we're letting that happen. So this is one more example, and all the examples are similar in that respect. It's not respecting and understanding how the process works and going and looking and see what really is on the ground, not in theory.
A couple of interesting Moses questions here. What do the panelists feel about Moses's park, beach, pool, and playground projects? Were they successful for their neighborhoods? I also would add Jones Beach. That's a pretty good place.
It's always everybody asks me about Jones Beach. It's a funny thing. Across this country during the WPA, we built some beautiful buildings. We built libraries and schools and parks. Moses had no, monopoly on how to do something with WPA money. Are those wonderful things? A, yes. B, is Moses the only one who could do them? I don't think so. And C, he didn't do them for the people who are using them today. He did them for white people. And it just so happens those white people left and went to the suburbs, and all sorts of different people now live in those neighborhoods and are enjoying the fruits of his labor, which he was not trying to give to them. So there's a sort of sweet irony in all that. And my point also about the parks, it's not just what he did, it's how he did it. He was ruthless, unforgiving. He was a man who believed in the ends and not the means. And that, as a small Democrat D, I don't accept that as legitimate. If we can't have it in a democratic way, then there's something wrong with what we're trying to do. And there were a lot of places that got some beautiful things. And look at what we're doing today. We are remaking the waterfront around this city with parks. And funny thing, Moses is not here, and communities are very much involved in the designing of these parks, not always totally to their satisfaction. But, and I write in the book, the biggest new park developed in this city since Central Park is the Hudson River Park that wouldn't have happened if we had Westway. And it's a very interesting kind of progression of different offerings, different amenities, because 3 different communities were very much involved in the process of shaping it. So you have some active sports areas, you have some passive, you have some kids, you have all sorts of things. And that variety came out of the design, the will, the demands or the input of those communities. And there's same things happening in Brooklyn. So the idea that we got parks and pools and all those things, of course, there was never any understanding that these things needed money to maintain them, and so all the pools are closed, or maybe it's the people who began to use them that got it closed. I'm not quite sure. But the point is, did we need Moses to have good amenities? I don't think so.
And I'm glad you're sitting down for this, because I want Roberta to tell you one little detail about Jones Beach, apropos of your comment that he built for white people. Tell us about the overpasses and Jones Beach.
Well, a lot of people know this, and although there have been some people in recent years trying to rehabilitate Moses who question this, but I checked with the transportation officials of this state, and it's true, the overpasses on the Parkway were built too low for public buses.
On
They're-
purpose.
On purpose. Therefore, cars. And in fact, a lot of this is all, I have to say, I learned about Robert Moses from Robert Caro. I have to be one of the few people that maybe read that book almost 3 times, because you can't absorb enough. It's an extraordinary book. The interesting thing about The Power Broker is it was published in 1974, and essentially I'm basically picking up where he left off, but it's so rich in stories about Moses, and this, of course, is the classic. Now, there are those who say that that's not true. There are those who say that it's not true that Moses kept the temperature too low in the pools in Harlem, of which I think he only built one, the proportion of where he put these things is kind of telling. But the fact is that Moses' right-hand man is quoted by Caro as saying that's what he did. The most dreadful thing to me is not just the overpasses, but Moses built Riverside Park not to go as far as it went north. He was forced by the mayor to keep going north. So what did he build in Harlem? He built the only comfort station in the city with a frieze of monkeys. And you tell me this man wasn't a racist? So between the overpasses, the comfort station, the proportion of where he put the playgrounds, and who he built for what, I think it's a record that speaks for itself.
Richard, someone writes, asks, does the ghost of Robert Moses survive in Mayor Michael Bloomberg, whether it's the top-down administration of the Park Department, Police Department, Education Department, notwithstanding public and community opposition to his policies?
Well, I think that person has answered their own question. So I'm going to answer, if I may, just briefly. Well, no, let's leave it at that.
Let me give a little nuance to this. About 2 weeks ago, the Municipal Arts Society held a really interesting 2-day summit on New York. And a number of people from the administration came and talked about what they were doing in each of the departments. And if you look at the things that everybody loves that's happening in this administration, they are very Jacobsian. If you look at the things that you don't like, that's a different issue. But we have to acknowledge no other mayor hired Jeanette Sada-Khan. You've got some great things happening in parks. Maybe sometimes it's top-down and maybe sometimes it isn't. You've got a lot of interesting things coming out of Department of Cultural Affairs. We have a lot of really good things going on. But as I say in this book, we have both Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses everywhere in this city and across the country. So sure, there's a lot of top-down thinking when it comes supporting some of the big projects, but that's not the whole story. We have Plan NYC, where there's a lot of thought given to the environment and to spreading our infrastructure in terms of waste management around and getting things back on rail and out of trucks. These are very important small things. They seem small. They're more obscure. They don't get written about as much as they should. But they add up to a lot of big positive change. So, since I'm now being moved over to function on the mayor's Sustainable Development Committee. I have to say there's some really good thinking going on there. One of the real deficiencies of Plan NYC, which hopefully I will be able to weigh in on, it's already been raised to them, is Plan NYC looking into the future and supposedly having an environmental approach to the future gives no mention to preservation. Now, preservation, and I don't mean just of historic preservation in the landmark sense, I mean of preserving the built environment as a resource not to lose, to build on what exists before you replace it. The greenest building is the building already standing. And that doesn't mean you can't add to next to it, that you can't replace some of it. But if you don't start there, then you're not really being very sustainable in your outlook to development. Unfortunately, the LEED standards, which were created by the architecture community, strictly is technological for new buildings. They've modified it very timidly, but I mean, at one point, and I'm not sure this is still true, you got as many points for putting in a bike rack as you did for saving an existing building. Right. So a lot needs to be done in that score, but the new thinking has emerged, and I think we're going to see more of that in the future.
I just want to add one thing to that, and I don't mean to give offense, but I've lived for most of the last 15 years in Britain. One of the things that has struck me about American thinking about the city is that, and particularly New Yorkers, is that we imagine we're the sort of cutting edge of everything. And in fact, in terms of urban design, we're not. This is, I would say, the quality of urban design in Europe, even in a city like London, which is very traditionalist, is much better than New York. It's easier to put up a risky building almost anywhere in Europe than it is in New York City. And you can see that in the quality of what we've got for the last 40 or 50 years. It's really ugly, you know? And it seems to me that one of the problems about this, and this is why I raise this, is not the question of preservation, although that's terribly important, but how can we get more innovation in ordinary buildings, schools, hospitals, they don't keep closing, ordinary public facilities like bus stops, you know, all of this. I spent a lot of time looking at new urban design, and very little of it is coming out of this country. And I think there's a cultural problem here. And it has to do, I think, in part with the reaction to Moses. He was such a destroyer. He was such a destructive force that the notion of resisting development became something that got very enracinated in New Yorkers on the left, I think also in other cities. And we haven't been very welcoming to architectural experiment at all. We're really behind what people are doing in other places. The only person I know who's really onto this is a man named Richard Kahn, who's building schools in New York. He fights for every architectural innovation that he tries to introduce into these schools. Everything is a struggle, you know? And I think many of you know this, if you're locals, in terms of Washington Square Park, which is one of the few pieces of really good landscape development that the city has had in a long time. They did nothing but fight against people who say, no, nothing can be changed. So I think there's a kind of self-criticism that we need to engage in New York. the left has become, I would say, in a way, too conservative, out of exactly the reaction to the horrors of what Moses produced. And I think we're really suffering from this. I know you disagree. But I feel it very strongly. I think there's something decayed about the notion that any development is likely to be oppressive and destroy something good.
Well, we finally found something to disagree about.
Yeah. We're
But
very
let-
good
but-
friends, but
But
this will
let
go
me
on.
explain, because I don't totally disagree, but this is my feeling. There's, we don't really have the so-called civic process that we pretend to have in this city, because most things are being decided by the Empire State Development Corporation. It's not, we don't really have a public process, and ideas are being, developers go to the planning department and say, this is what I want to do, and they tinker with it, and they do this and they do that, and then they take it to the community, and they wonder why the community goes up in arms, because the community has not had a seat at the table from the beginning. This is, and often today there are people who say Jane Jacobs has, kind of disintegrated into NIMBYism. This is my definition. Every pushback community in this city that I have followed, there is an alternative vision presented. It's an alternative for change. It's not stopping change. It's helping shape change. NIMBY is only valid to me when it's just stop, no alternative. And I haven't found that to be the case. In every contested project in this city, there is an alternative, and an alternative voice that wasn't part of the story from the beginning. And that's my resistance to the idea that it's all about stopping change. It's about what kind of change. And again, there's a wonderful image that Jane used to share about change in the days when it was black and white, change is progress. She says there are two kinds of change, and you could see it on the landscape. One is about nurturing the landscape, adding new growth, taking care of the existing growth, seeing it flourish, seeing it grow. And the other kind of change, also change, is about erosion and the death of plant material, the lack of variety of the plant material, the formation of gullies occur, and good soil is washed away. That too is change. But one is positive and one is negative.
But Roberta, what I'm talking about is, really you can see it in Jane's work, she's hostile to architectural creation.
And let's remember the time she's writing.
True, but that's
58.
true. Well, it's also the age of some wonderful architecture. But I think there's an issue here about how we become more friendly to designing the physical environment in ways which are unfamiliar, which are challenges to people to rethink how they live in space. And my worry is that we have a kind of mindset, and you see it in Manhattan. It's an entirely predictable environment. There's no surprise in it, in what's being built. Those old, the New Law tenements in the late 19th century, those were surprising to people. People hadn't lived in housing forms like that before.
But the interesting thing...
That's my worry about this.
Well, here's a little factoid that really shocks people. Some of the most interesting, innovative, well-designed new buildings are in historic districts.
Of course.
And, but this is like in contradiction to what you hear, not what you're saying, but what is often said out there is that, we're not permitting that kind of change. We've had, basically I agree with you, Richard, the general quality of our architecture is bottom line, developer-driven, that's it. But occasionally, we are getting some really interesting buildings in the last 10 years, I'd say. But they're going through a different kind of process. They're not, the Vornado went to the Planning Commission to ask for more bulk for the site, for the building they want to build on the Penn Hotel, Pennsylvania Hotel. They just got it. I mean, and we've seen images of it in the paper. It's horrific, but it's just FAR plopped on top of FAR going up into the sky. There's no creativity there, and they're not being asked to. They're not being limited to what they're asking for. The story got turned into whether it should be as tall or taller than the Empire State Building, and that could be an issue on its own. But the reality is they shouldn't have gotten what they asked for. They already had plenty of FAR. The excuse is that it's next to public transit and there are a couple of little tinkerings with the train station. That's no excuse. And with that kind of process, that's what we're going to get.
Well, I hate to take away the punch bowl right as the party is getting good, but we've run out of time. There's sadly some fantastic questions still left on the table, but just this last one that only requires a one-syllable answer from the panel. Robert Moses, Darth Vader of urban planning, yes or no? Here's the argument. A good government Jedi Knight, but warped, kinky, sucked in by the dark side, the automobile during World War II, and then he came out as Vader. You buying that?
Since I don't really know enough about Darth Vader, if it's a negative image, I accept it.
All right, Roberta Brandeis Gratz, Richard Sennett, The Nation Books, NYU. Thanks for convening this.